Hello, everybody. Happy Friday. It is Friday lunchtime. You know what time it is. Window watch time. We're myself and Paddy Davitt look at all the latest Norwich City transfer rumours and news and try and cut through the nonsense for you a little bit. Of course, if you have any questions for us across the next 45 minutes or so, then do get them in the comments box, and we'll try and get through as many as we can. Although I think in the last few weeks, it's fair to say, we've been absolutely inundated with questions. So if we might leave ones if ones have already been answered. And of course, if you are joining us slightly late, which I guess is irrelevant to the people watching now, then you can watch it back on whichever device you happen to be watching on at a later point. Pad, let's start. I guess we kind of spoke it up last week, really. It's been quite well, certainly in terms of incomings, it's been a quiet week. We'll obviously dive into all the specifics and names in a moment, but it does feel like things have calmed down to an extent in terms of the transfer flurry that we saw a couple of weeks or so ago with obviously Angus Gunn, Milo Rashica and Billy Gilmore arriving. It's been a relatively quiet one in terms of incoming.
To be honest, I don't know about you, mate. I'm quite glad we've had a week where it's just been a bit calmer because it went a bit turbo, culminating with Gilmore, obviously, who that felt like I was going on for about 16 years, that actual process. But we got there eventually. And probably inevitable, coinciding, of course, with the non-Euro contingent and Daniel and his coaching staff all back at Colney from Monday onwards this week. So maybe the focus slightly tilts a little bit to the lads are already in the building, but you can be sure Stuart, Kieran Scott and those guys, they'll be continuing apace. And, you know, it'll probably pick up between now and certainly the Liverpool game. I'm pretty sure. I think there'll be a few more in before then. But yeah, in terms of the last 7 days, it does feel it's more about clearing the decks, if you want to use that phrase, but certainly thinning out the squad. Since we convened here last Friday afternoon, Sebastian Sotto's move went through. You were on at the weekend, turned that around. You know, the season-long loan with a view to buy to Porto. So good luck to that lad. Obviously, we've had Akin Famewu, young centre-back, similar loan with a view to buy, going out to Charlton or back to Charlton, where he was on loan last season. And obviously, Josip Drmic, who had 12 months left, and he'll be spending them back in Croatian football at Rijeka, HNK Rijeka. So essentially the end of his Norwich career. So off the back of the previous week where Stiepermann, Leitner both left as well, it just feels a little bit like maybe the housekeeping is about outs rather than ins this week. And I think that'll probably stay the case from what we're led to believe for the next period, certainly the next few days. Not hearing anything is imminent inward. So ultimately, you know, it's probably going to be more about thinning the squad out in the short term, but ultimately what they're looking to do by doing that is create a few spaces to maybe up the quality threshold, which, at the risk of repeating what we've said ad nauseum all summer, that's ultimately, you know, if you were pinning a sort of a mantra on the wall for Norwich City and the Stuart Webber in this window, it's more quality, less quantity, and that's what it boils down to. So these periods we're going through now, these last 7 days, are probably more about and it's obviously not as glamorous or sexy or as exciting, but all part of the same process, just reconfiguring a squad that is fit for purpose in the Premier League.
Absolutely. Before we delve into all the names, and you mentioned a few there, which we'll get into, we've had a couple of questions already from Peaky NCC on YouTube, which I'll flash up here. Also, Jack as well on YouTube has asked it about whether you suspect there'll be another one before the Kings Lynn game. Of course, Norwich City's first pre-season game at the Walks next Friday evening, isn't it? Do you expect we'll see any additions to the squad by then? I think obviously there's a few people looking particularly at that midfield area and thinking it looks a bit short at the moment.
Yeah, although I see they put out those training pics and Rupp is taking a full part, so you know he's available. You'd thought Gilmore's not with them at the moment, but I'd imagine, I don't know 100%, but I would imagine that from the start of next week he'll be back in the building. So in terms of the Kings Lynn game, I'm just thinking central midfield options. A guy who hasn't been named or mentioned too often, and it just popped into my head when Josh Martin's loan to MK went through. But of course, Louis Thompson, who was there at MK last season. Now, I'm not saying he's now going to be the answer to their central midfield quest in the Premier League, but in terms of the here and now, there's a central midfielder who is part of it, you would think. I've not heard anything to the contrary. So I wouldn't be at all surprised if he's, at least in the early part of pre-season, still part of Norwich's rota, as it were. But any new ones before Kings Lynn? Well, that is a week away. So it's probably, you don't want to be giving a definitive yes or no at this stage, because these things do move very helter-skelter. But right here, right now, on this Friday afternoon, no, I don't hear of anything that is close to stand by your beds, we're about to press the button. So, but as I say, there's and we'll let's get straight into him. Christopher Ajer, I'm sure we'll be getting into him in depth, but that deal, or that potential deal, is something that process has started from pretty much the end of last season. That's when the initial contact went in with Celtic. We've had the fresh line. If you've not checked it out, please go to pinken.com. It's all there up in the last 24 hours. So the process of getting these deals over the line, there's a lot of work already gone in, you can be sure, and things can accelerate now. If, using that as hypothetical, Celtic do the central defenders they're getting linked with in terms of they bring their new players in, and there's a realism in terms of the valuation on Ajer, which doesn't seem to be the case at the minute from the Celtic end, then that is, in our understanding, something that could happen relatively quickly, because a lot of the legwork's already gone in. So, there's a lot of hypotheticals in play here. But right here, right now, as we sit here on this Friday afternoon, no, there's nothing imminent ahead of that Kings Lynn game. But would I be surprised if there's a new signing in the building by Kings Lynn? No, by the same token, because it's quite clear they are still in the market and intend to bring in centre-back, centre-mid. And increasingly, looks like the striker and maybe another wide player is maybe not as prominent, certainly not grabbing as many headlines at the minute, but that is something that's happening in the background. I think they are, and we'll probably get into it in a bit more depth with the Jordan Hugill talk this week, but that's two other areas I think they would like to do something. So if they get that type of business done, then it's going to be quite busy, isn't it? Another 4 or 5 potentially.
Yeah, absolutely, which indicates that Norwich City are very active, and the nature of a transfer window is that things can move very quickly, sometimes very slowly, and that seems, as you say, a good place to start, because it's certainly moving slowly with Christopher Ajer. Keith Shaw simply asked on Facebook, sums this up quite nicely. He just says, "What on earth is going on with Ajer?" Which I suppose is a nice way to start, because obviously we've seen the reports north of the border. A lot of Norwich City and £12 million. A new bid mentioned in the same sentence. You obviously you kind of alluded to it there, the story that you put up yesterday about that not being the case. Just give us, as you understand it, the latest on that situation with Christopher Ajer and why it's maybe not as it seems, or maybe as it has been reported in the last week or so.
Well, as we understand it, from Norwich's perspective, that hasn't moved on from, I lose track now, it was about 10 days, no, it's probably longer than that now, 2 to 3 weeks ago, when it was Norwich have called their interest. And that's, from the Norwich angle, pretty much where it's been parked. Norwich haven't made any further bids beyond the one they did at the back end of last month, which was 10 up front plus add-ons. For me, looking at it, I'm getting the sense maybe that's where there's a bit of confusion, irrespective to whatever any other agendas are going on there, that this 12 million figure, because if you add in the add-ons, then maybe you're getting up to around a 12 million package, but the actual upfront figure was 10. And again, as to repeat what I said earlier, that first contact happened almost before the end of last season, when they made contact with Celtic. But as it was told to me, I don't think Celtic had they obviously didn't have a manager in place at that point, or a sporting director. I think there's a bit of going on, isn't there, with Peter Lovell as well, the chief exec up there. So it looked like there was a bit of a uncertainty in terms of who's doing what roles there at that stage. But it obviously had progressed to the point where Norwich had shown their hand, as it were. By all accounts, that wasn't the figures Celtic were looking to deal with. And now you're seeing 12, you're seeing 15 million, I've seen in the last 24 hours, that's the figure they're circulating reportedly to agents. Leverkusen have been interested. Newcastle have been linked with him. If you're Celtic, stands to reason you want to get the most you can get for that player. And by encouraging an auction, maybe that's how you can do it. But certainly, as it stands, Norwich will not be getting embroiled in an auction. As it was mentioned to me, that they won't be going back with another 12, 15 million plus add-ons. That's simply not the figures that Norwich attach to a guy who's now in the last 12 months of his contract. So, ultimately, as I said earlier, that isn't going to happen unless there's some movement. And of course, Norwich, I'm sure, would be willing to discuss around the margins of how these deals get put together and the clauses that are attendant in a lot of these deals. But I've got no sense whatsoever that Norwich are suddenly going to say, okay, you want 12 or 15 up front, there's the money. That isn't going to happen. Norwich have got their valuation of that player, and there'll have to be a little bit of realism the Celtic end. And if there isn't, then I think Norwich are now, as they have been for the last 2 weeks, really looking at other targets. There's a feeling that if they had to go, maybe if there wasn't a value in terms of elsewhere in the centre-back positions, then they would be willing to consider a loan, Premier League loan. They've obviously brought in Gilmour. They've got another one available. Doesn't look like Ollie Skipp's going to fit that criteria from the noises coming out of the Tottenham end. So that is an avenue they could utilise if they wanted to go down that route. And the other thing I've heard in the last day or two, that the man who's come back and absolutely looking top drawer already in pre-season is Andrew Omobamidele. Apparently he's kicked on from where he left off at the back end of last season, and he's really probably grown as well physically, but as much as anything else over the summer, because he is, only 19, isn't he, going on 20? But by all accounts, he is already looking like a player who could do a job. Not from the start, I'm not trying to suggest he would be one of Norwich's 2 centre backs against Liverpool on the opening weekend, but certainly a guy who is he too far away from being involved in the Premier League, or could he actually be a bona fide member of that Premier League squad? And the initial noises are that, yes, he could. So if that is the case, and Zimmerman's going nowhere, and we know Hanley and Gibson are going nowhere, then you've got 4 centre-backs, haven't you? So if that is the equation, then do you need a £10 million Christopher Ajer? They'd like to do something, yes, but as always with Stuart Webber at the helm, it'll be on Norwich's terms. So they won't be getting led around or down a route where they overpay for Ajer or any other player. So long-winded answer, but the answer is basically Ajer is where it was 2 weeks ago. Until there's some realism in terms of valuations or some movement from other end, then nothing will happen. Norwich will not be going back in for the figures that are being put about in the media.
Yeah, and I think that's fair to say that the majority of that seems to be coming from Celtic's end, right? So it is, as you mentioned there, an attempt to create an auction to drive up that price as much as they can. Obviously, Bayer Leverkusen as well have been mentioned amongst a host of German clubs, really. Newcastle were also mentioned, but that interest seems to have cooled significantly since we saw that at the start of the transfer window. And as you mentioned there, Pat, I guess the crucial element is that 1 year left on his deal, isn't it? Because can you really charge a club? We're not talking about an elite player in terms of top level English club or whatever, someone who's played a lot in the Champions League, a big club at Celtic, but 1 year left on his deal. I mean, 12 million, 15 million, however you want to bracket it, does seem like a lot of money. And as you mentioned, that would put it out of Norwich City's price range. So you've kind of done what I was hoping to do anyway, which is broaden it out in terms of if Ajer doesn't progress and if that doesn't happen, what are their next options? You kind of talked about a Premier League loan there. You've spoken about Andrew Mbamidele. I'll mention in as well that Sebastian Bornau, who was the centre-back that they were interested in from Cologne, he looks set to move to Wolfsburg in the Bundesliga. So that's another one that you can kind of cross a line through. What kind of, and this is purely, I guess, on feeling at this moment, is your feeling that Celtic will eventually come to the table and play ball? Is it that they will keep driving that price tag at? Is it that Norwich actually move their attentions elsewhere? How do you see this kind of going? Because as ever, in a move like this, there's always a lot of politics from both sides.
Well, I'd say two things, looking at it in terms of the Celtic aspect from a long way away. But one, if they're looking for central defensive players to come in, and I've seen 3 names now linked. They brought in a lad from Sheffield Wednesday, but he might be a bit of a longer term project. But there's the guy at Ruben Kazan. I'm not going to pronounce his name. There's the guy at my memory's letting me down now. Cameron Carter-Vickers, the Chelsea centre-back. I've seen him linked in the last 24 hours in the Daily Record. And a Croatian, under 21 international, who apparently was left out of Hajduk Split's squad last weekend. So straight away I'm seeing that. I'm saying, well, okay, if you were keeping Christopher Ajer, why are you actively looking to bring in centre-backs? So straight away I'm thinking, yeah, we'll bring ours in before we let him go. And then also, ultimately, that the player himself has made it clear he sees his future away from Glasgow. And then finally, if you're Celtic, you've got a depreciating asset there. If he was to stay and didn't go in this window, then come January, he's free to sign a pre-contract with clubs overseas. And let's be honest, we often hear about the lack of financial clout that there is in the Scottish game in terms of the broadcast revenue comparable to the Premier League. and we're just coming, hopefully through a pandemic and the impact that's had financially on all clubs. I saw a report this morning that apparently Man City have lost 250 million due to the pandemic. That's what they're pegging Man City's loss at. Norwich, £30 million hole. Celtic will have lost tens of millions. There's no doubt about it. Lack of revenue, 60,000 at Parkhead every other weekend, deprived of that for a season and a bit. So they're under pressure in terms of this situation because they cannot allow Christopher Ajer, I don't think, to get to a situation where he's still in the building beyond this summer. So if that's the case, you're rolling the dice in terms of hoping that there's sufficient interest elsewhere to be able to play A off against B and against C. Now, if Leverkusen and Newcastle, if they've decided they're going to look in different areas and Norwich are the only show in town, then it probably swings back towards a deal that can be done on Norwich's terms. Because if Norwich are the only club left willing to pay 10 million plus, then I think if you're Celtic, you have to trade, don't you? Because there's absolutely no point if you're Celtic in holding on to a player who could potentially go for nothing. That simply, if you're Celtic, I see no way that could be allowed to happen, given the lack of financial clout you have in the Scottish game and the impacts of the pandemic on Celtic's finances. So I think the longer this plays out, then the more chance that Norwich can get this player on the financial terms they want to do it. And I think that's worth reiterating again. If Norwich are willing to look at loan routes and also potentially go with what they've got, if they feel Amor Bamadelli has stepped on again since the end of last season, then there's a fair degree of relaxation from Norwich. Yes, of course, at the start of the summer, they probably felt they needed to bring in a top draw, potentially Premier League grade centre-back. But things move on, things evolve, things change. And, if that's no longer quite as urgent a pressing priority, then if I'm Celtic, I'll be getting a little bit concerned, because what they don't want is to keep steadfast to prices that clubs aren't going to be willing to pay for a guy who is now 11 months out from the end of his contract. That's the nature of it, which is why, Stuart Webber, for example, is always very, very keen to, we see it, the contract extensions on one level is rewarding players, but it's also insulating your football club, isn't it? That you don't get into these type of situations where highly desirable assets could potentially go for nowhere near their market value.
Yeah, and it's just worth ending on Ajer to say, has linked up with Celtic, hasn't he, in their Wales camp, and didn't feature in their first pre-season friendly, but then neither did anyone who's been involved in internationals as of yet. I think they play a friendly again tomorrow against Charlton, I want to say, and then one next Wednesday as well. So that might give us a bit more of an indication as to the situation. But he's made no secret of his desire to leave the club, and as you mentioned there, the longer it rumbles on, perhaps the more it tilts back towards Norwich. So we'll watch that one with interest. No doubt we'll be speaking about it again this time. Well, maybe not this time next week if we've got the pre-season friendly and whatnot, but we'll have to see. Another one as well hasn't really evolved in terms of the situation, but we had some quotes from new Bournemouth manager Scott Parker this week about Philip Billing. He is a player that Norwich City like. We understand that he's relatively keen as well on leaving Bournemouth if an opportunity arose. Some very kind of straight back, non-committal quotes from Scott Parker, but interesting nonetheless. What did you make of his comments in midweek?
Well, yeah, I mean, I thought it was interesting that he talked up what a great guy he is, and he'd love to work with him. But then in the same breath, it was kind of almost a defeatist. We know there'll be interest from bigger clubs, I think was his phrase. So if you're Norwich, you'll take that all day long. But except for me, an acceptance that maybe, as we possibly understand it, the player may have intimated or through his advisors that if there's a Premier League opportunity, we'll say hypothetically that he'd be quite open to the idea of that. So as always with these things, there's three moving parts. There's the buying club, the selling club, and the player and his representatives and his family and his close circle. And if the player is looking to move on, and also, again, talking about Celtic and finances, I know Bournemouth have some serious backing, but another season in the Championship, I'm sure, was not on the agenda, and they might have to make some tough financial calls as well about their squad. And obviously, they'll want to give Scott Parker some ammunition to go into the market and bring in the type of players he wants to bring. To do that, they might have to sort of recycle the squad and bring in revenue to allow him to do what he wants to do. So I read those quotes as fairly encouraging if you're coming at it from a Norwich perspective. But again, from what I've heard, there needs to be a bit of realism in terms of maybe Bournemouth's valuation on that player. I don't think Norwich would be looking to pay beyond 9 or 10 million again for that guy up front, and then whatever clauses you want to insert. And until that's the case, I think his contract status is 2024 off the top of my head. I had a look the other day. So contrasted with Ajer, Bournemouth are in a bit of a stronger position. But, for me, Norwich really have the upper hand in both those potential negotiations, because if, as in both cases, we're led to believe the player wants out, then then a deal can be made. It's just a realism between the buying and the selling club, and for both reasons, I think both those clubs probably would be eventually willing to cash in. So he's certainly one they like. There's no doubt about it. It was told to me that, because ultimately you're thinking, well, central midfield, are we talking the sort of a skip replacement in the 6 or the 8 role? But, apparently he played most of the last season for Bournemouth in the 10, which is pertinent because, we had this debate, I think, on here last Friday that with Wendy gone and Stiepermann to a lesser degree, there's a huge emphasis on who plays that link role, that very important link role to Timu Pukki, if it is Timu Pukki. Dowell and Cantwell are the two that spring to mind. Rashica, we were led to believe, can play down the middle. But if you dropped another option like a Philip Billing in there who played in that position, I think off the top of my head, when they came to Carrow towards the back end of last season, he was playing in a sort of more of a 10 aggressive advanced role. So you've got a multi-purpose midfielder, which if you're Norwich, and to repeat myself, it's less personnel but higher quality threshold. You've got a player who can play 2 or 3 different roles in the Premier League. That's a very desirable asset. So, yeah, there's a lot of reasons why they'd like to bring him in. But again, not to the extent where they will pay over the odds. That simply isn't going to happen under Stuart Webber this summer. Yeah,
it's so very much a case of balls in the courts of Bournemouth and Celtic, and I'm sure those two will rumble on. In terms of other incomings, we spoke about the young lad at Ipswich Town who looks set for a move to Norwich, Liam Gibbs. We spoke about him on our Pinkham podcast, so you can listen to that for a bit more depth on him. So we'll skip past him. And then the only other link we had at the top end of the week, and I haven't practiced my pronunciation of this, so I could go wrong. Elias Abebu from Hoffenheim, who is sort of recognised as a striker, but played a lot as a winger for Hoffenheim. It was a lot of people were saying, it's a link to a striker. That wasn't necessarily the case. He's played a lot out on the right, I think, for Hoffenheim, possibly left. An interesting one, but again, not one that there was any sort of truth in. But it does lead us on nicely, I think, to the Jordan Hugill, Josip Dermic. I suppose we could probably widen out more broadly to those attacking positions, the wing options, but perhaps what people will be more interested in is that striking option. And I think we've probably carried the line, haven't we, all summer really, that wasn't a position necessarily at the top of their priorities, unless certain things began to maybe line up that they would then need to do something. We've seen a little bit of movement on that front this week in terms of Nottingham Forest getting linked to Jordan Hugill, and there hasn't been any sort of contact, but I would imagine both parties, both Norwich and Jordan Hugill, would probably be open to something if it did pop up from the Championship. Forest would make a lot of sense. They've lost Glenn Murray. Chris Hughton will want an experienced Championship striker at the top end of his pitch, at the top end of the pitch. Jordan Hugill fits that profile. It's going to be interesting to see how it develops, but it does change the way we talk about that striker debate, doesn't it, Pad?
100%. And they have actively looked at Adam Armstrong, who had a prolific season with Blackburn. It looks by all accounts, maybe Southampton are in pole position, given Danny Ings has indicated he's not going to sign a new deal. But that was there 3 or 4 weeks ago. So straight away, that did raise an eyebrow or two. Why would they need a frontline, very probably expensively acquired striker when you've got Mr. Pukki and Hugill and Adamida? But clearly, if they're willing to entertain the idea of Hugill moving on, and the lad himself wants regular game time, that's kind of, I think, where this is in terms of that dynamic. Not, as you rightly say, not in terms of Forest necessarily, but certainly a Championship level opportunity. I think that will happen personally. And if that did happen, then you're basically going into the Premier League season with Timu, who, let's be honest, there still has to be some fitness concerns around him, given what he had to endure going through to make the Euros, that ankle problem, and he didn't look himself at the Euros by his own admission. And you've got him and Adamida, completely unproven himself, who had a very stop-start season last season. So there's no doubt about it. Dermich, obviously, to more of a housekeeping sense, because he wasn't going to play anyway in terms of Norwich's Premier League. But senior strikers, you cannot go into the Premier League with two. I mean, that's just not going to happen. So I think it's safe to assume they are now willing to bring in another forward, and part of that is the equation that possibly Jordan Hugill is going to move on. I mean, we got the sense, you're right, at the start of the summer, it was pretty clear that the centre-back, centre-mid, a wide player who could play down the middle, i.e. Rashica, that they were the priority areas. And obviously the keeper situation, that needed to resolve itself, which it has done. No Nyland, but Angus Gunn coming in. But also it was pretty clear to me at the start of the summer that if there is interest in Hugill, Hernandez, Waheta, then if it makes sense from the club's point of view in terms of the financials around that, they wouldn't be averse to making those deals happen. And if that is the case, then by definition, what you're being told there is that they're willing maybe to look at those areas as well in terms of their own recruitment. And I think that increasingly looks to be the case, that while inevitably we've spent, how long, 20 minutes talking about a centre-back and a centre midfielder, and that's kind of dominated most of Norwich's business, certainly post-Gilmore. But I think increasingly they're also now looking to do something forward-wise and another wide player, because if you look at the basic numbers, that I know they're trying to thin out the squad, but you've lost Wendy, you've lost Marco Stiepermann. You brought in one, but you probably need another wide player if you feel maybe Onel and Waheta aren't going to be part of it or a leading part of it. So for me at the minute, it feels like those four areas now, centre-back, centre-mid, forward, wide player. And if that is the case, it's understandable why that Hoffenheim lad was thrown in, although we don't think there was anything in that in terms of currently anyway. But if you're asking me by the end of the window, do I expect Jordan Hugill to be here? No, I don't think he is. I think for all those reasons stated, if he wants to, quite rightly, go and play football now, play regular football, feel a part of it, then you can understand that. And from Norwich's point of view, it's quite clear he wouldn't dislodge Timu, Adam either. They expect big things of, so let him go. Hopefully recoup the money they paid from in the first place, and then use that to bring in another forward who more fits the profile maybe of what Daniel and Stuart are looking for in terms of a Premier League forward.
Yeah, he's 29 as well, isn't he, Jordan? So he's probably at that stage now where he does need to look for perhaps something that isn't going to be playing second fiddle to Timu Pukki. But it's going to be a really interesting one to see how they resolve that, because obviously 2 years ago they went down the free transfer route, and if Timu Pukki's fit and well, if he's fit, basically he starts, doesn't he, under Daniel Farke? So then how do you try and recruit someone? Certainly with the objective of initially not going in to be the starting striker, that becomes a very difficult dynamic. And obviously you mentioned the wing as well. I did see we had a question about that from Joe Keeler in terms of he simply asked, hey guys, do they want another winger, question marks, over whether Hernandez and Placheta are good enough for the Premier League? And as you've mapped out there, that the indication seems to be that they do. Just a couple of other lines. You mentioned Akin Famewu at the top. He's joined Charlton, hasn't he, on a season-long loan, but interestingly this time with an option to buy. You wrote a piece on that this morning. Just talk to us a little bit about maybe why Norwich have reached that decision, because there was a stage where he was really highly thought of. We saw him included in some Premier League squads, for example. He came on against Manchester City, didn't he? He's a player that Daniel Farke really likes. So what has happened, and I guess there's an obvious answer to this really, that's maybe seen him forced out of the door a little bit?
Well, timing is everything. That was the essence of that piece I wrote. And you're right. He made the bench a couple of times in the Premier League, didn't quite get on. Quite understandably, huge leap to go from development level as he was playing to Premier League. And then the dial turned, and he's finding himself out on loan at St Mirren. I think he had a few injury issues along the way, both at St Mirren. I think that was curtailed because of the pandemic, but also I recall there was an injury as well, putting doubt whether he'd be available at the back end of that Premier League season. But he actually did, as you say rightly, made his one and only appearance at Man City that final day hammering. But even then at Charlton last season, I think I couldn't tell you exactly what, but there was injury issues. So whether that's flown into the equation, but ultimately, as you rightly say, I think the biggest part of that jigsaw is the emergence of another young, 3 years younger, to be honest, central defensive option out of Norwich's academy, and that's Andrew Omabamidele, who, as I say, was sold this week. He absolutely looks an unbelievable Nick already in the first few days of pre-season. So, and what we saw from him in that 10-game burst at the back end of last season, the maturity, the composure. Yes, it wasn't the leap into a Premier League scenario that for Mayweather would have been faced with that time, but there was still a lot of pressure at that stage of the season. No Gibson, no Zimmerman. Yes, Norwich were in a very healthy position when he got put in at Preston on Good Friday, was it? Easter Monday, Good Friday. But it was still a huge question mark against him. And boy, oh boy, did he answer every question put in front of him. To the extent where, as I say, I think they now feel he's a justifiable Premier League grade option for the squad. And if they feel they've got one of those young types that close to Daniel's first team plans, then sadly, it's the brutal nature of the development sort of cycle that Atkins' time has come and gone, really. And you hope, because obviously I think Charlton just missed out in terms of the playoff picture last season on goal difference. Under Nigel Adkins, and some very experienced manager who knows what it takes to get promotion. They are and have been a Premier League staple in times gone by, not that too distant. There's been a huge amount of upheaval with the ownership there, hasn't there, in recent times? I think that looks like it's settled down. You'd fully expect Charlton to be really in the mix for League One promotion. And if he plays a leading part, then good luck to him. That deal gets made into a permanent and he's in 12 months' time maybe a championship player. So from his point of view, makes perfect sense. And I think from Norwich's point of view as well, because of the emergence of young Daly. And of course, if they were to bring in another centre-back, where would that leave Akin even further down the pecking order? He's outgrown development football. So I think that's a win-win for all parties, in my opinion.
Yeah, absolutely. And then the final one is another sort of youth player, if you like. Rob Nizzet looks set to return to Belgium, doesn't he? That's the final one in terms of the solid outgoings. Anyway, so let's move on to some of your questions. We'll start with Tom on Facebook, who has said, "Hi guys, if we sold Hugill, would we get a player like him but an upgrade, or a player who can play on the shoulder more and has pace?" This is kind of what I was framing. It's difficult, isn't it? Because Norwich City are essentially recruiting a second choice striker, which becomes incredibly difficult, doesn't it? I think if you're trying to sell that to a player.
It is, but then are they? Because nobody can dispute Teemu Pukki, prolific at championship level. He's proved that beyond doubt now, but started like a house on fire in the Premier League as well. And it isn't just about Teemu Pukki in isolation. It's about, a team who are providing him with the service and the chances that he needs to show what he's about. But I think there still are one or two question marks about him in terms of Premier League. And more so, for me, the workload that man has had for club and country now over the last few years is absolutely ridiculous. Daniel always throws out the no striker in Western Europe has probably played more for their club and country than that man. And I think you wouldn't dispute that. So if that is the case, there's a lot of miles gone on the clock there. He's coming off the back of, as I say, a Euros where, physically he might have been able to get out there and play, but it wasn't the Teemu Pukki anybody would associate in a Norwich shirt. That razor sharpness, which you need at that level, and you also need it in the Premier League. So irrespective of the Hugels situation, if you're looking at it and you're thinking, well, you've got a very unproven talent in Adam Ida, and you've also got a player in Teemu who's played a lot of football. The second part of his Premier League season, the first time round, was disrupted by injury, that foot problem. He did it at Leicester, and he never looked the same player again, albeit the team in general, their form was going down, which wouldn't have helped him either. But I think you have to look at it and feel, well, what if for any length of time you were without Teemu in the top flight this season as well, which is not beyond the realms of possibility. So if that is the case, can you put so much emphasis on Adam Ida? I don't think you can. So it is an interesting one, because you're right. If Teemu Pukki was fit and firing, Daniel Farke is literally he's the chairman and the of his fan club. He will play him. There's no two ways about it, because he loves the player and loves what he's done for him. But if he isn't available for any length of time, you need to cover yourself. And you could say the same about central defence. Why are they actively looking for a 10 million type of centre back when you've just brought Gibson in on a permanent? You've got Hanley coming off the back of it, his best season in Norwich colours. Excuse me. You've got a young player in Obama Daly who looks to be making strides by the week. Do you need to spend 10 on a centre back? But it's all about competition, isn't it? And raising the quality threshold. And if that is the case, and let's be honest, Teemu Pukki, he shouldn't carry the same burden he did 2 seasons ago, that all the goals is on his shoulders. There needs to be a far more equitable share around of the goals. And if that is the case, bringing in an an actual forward who's able to hit the ground running in the Premier League, that's going to ease a bit of the burden on Timu, isn't it? So, increasingly, I'm starting to see why they might be willing to spend quite a few quid on a forward. Whereas at the start of summer, you thought, well, listing their priorities, they didn't need or probably had the money to be able to do that. But now, as we move through, and as I say, the evolving situation around what they might do centre back wise, if you've earmarked 10 million for Ajer and then you go and bring in a centre back from a Premier League loan route, then that's 10 million that can be redirected elsewhere, isn't there? So that's I think how they're probably looking at it, that they have this pot of money, they have the targets they want and the positions they want. And within that, they're going to be, very flexible and reactive to the situation as it evolves throughout the summer, as we get nearer the start of the season and then into the season, because obviously the window overhangs the start of the Premier League season. So it might even be a case, they get to the first 2 or 3 games, then maybe have a better idea, in terms of Timu and his fitness and his threat at Premier League level and go from there. So, yeah, I think, as I say, Hugo out, and if Hugo goes, they will bring in a forward. It's simple as that to me, because you cannot go into the Premier League season with just Ida and Timu Pukki, can you?
No, you can't, and it just goes to show how situations evolve, doesn't it? Over a matter of weeks, really. It's just a few weeks ago, as you said there, that certainly the noises were that a striker wasn't on their sort of high up on their list of priorities, whereas now, like you say, maybe it has shifted for various reasons. Neil Luther has said, any news on Daniel Farke's contract? I think we've been asked this probably in everyone that we've done. It's still progressing, isn't it, Pad? As far as we're aware, it remains on course to be signed before the opening game against Liverpool. So no need to fear over Daniel Farke's contract. A question from I'm the Dude, which is an excellent name. How many players do you think Norwich will sign? 3 to 5, etc. I'll probably change this a little bit and maybe say how many more players do you expect to sign? But we've kind of mapped that out already, Pad, and the positions that maybe they're looking to strengthen.
Well, I'd say that's a good spread, 3 to 5 from here. Yeah, obviously and I'm seeing a few questions flying in about Max Aarons' situation. So as it stands, I think they'd like to do maybe another 3 minimum. But if Max was to depart, then it changes again, doesn't it? Because they'd need to go and do a right back. There's no two ways about it. And in terms of Max, we've seen him. He's back at Colney. He's in the mix. He's part of it. He's a Norwich player at the minute. And there hasn't been anything tangible this summer, as we're led to believe, in regard of that man moving on. And that's encouraging, because, I surely felt before the window opened, by this stage of the summer, we might have had an Emi Buendia type situation on our hands. But for whatever reason, that hasn't materialised yet. That isn't to say, because, I'm looking down at my calendar. It's the 9th of July. The window's open until the end of August. We're probably only about not even halfway through the transfer window. So things will pick up now as the Euros come to a conclusion, and we get into the actual club cycle, pre-season, and then the start of the season. I wouldn't be hoping, I wouldn't be at this stage thinking, right, that's it. There's been no speculation around Max. He's going to be a Norwich player for the rest of this coming Premier League season. I still think there's more than a chance that he'll leave, but it'll only be for Buendia scale finances. And again, current throughout all the things that are happening in the transfer window for me is the pandemic impact and what that is doing to potential transfers. Obviously United have done a ridiculous amount of money on Jadon Sancho. So as Stuart said to us at the end of the season, the top clubs will still find the money, and it will take a top club to prize Max out of Norwich City. So I think there are clubs who would be able to meet the valuation Norwich have. But when you're dealing with deals of that nature, these things tend to drag on and on a little bit. So, yeah, I think we can expect increasingly now there'll be more speculation around Max's future. But right here, right now, it's as you were at the start of the summer, end of last season. Max Aarons is a Norwich player. There's been no anything approaching sort of Buendia levels of firm interest. So, for all our sakes, let's hope that continues. Because one thing with Max Aarons, he showed it last season, his attitude will be spot on, professional to the nth degree. And if nothing is materialising in terms of potential moves, he will be as good as gold. He'll get his head down and he will show what he's all about in the Premier League for Norwich. I've no doubt about that.
Yeah, and you mentioned there the transfer window overhanging the new season. A couple of good performances in the Premier League, and you never know what will happen, and maybe who will pick up the phone. And Barcelona and Roma, of course, the two clubs that have picked up in the last two transfer windows. So that would indicate there will be something at some point. It's just whether that financially meets Norwich's demands and whether it suits Max as well. It's going to be interesting. He's obviously arrived at Colney sporting a new haircut, Pad. You've not considered that one yet?
I did actually, but only not by accident, rather than design. I went in post when we was allowed to go in. I said I wanted a trim, came out looking more than a trim. But what can you do when the hair's around your feet in the barber's chair? You can't do a lot, can you, mate? So no, I'm far too. That's more of a young man's haircut, Connor. I expect you'll be sporting that by the time we get to Liverpool, mate.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I don't think my hair's changed for about 10 years, to be honest. I'm quite unadventurous with my haircuts. Anyway, Liam Winhall has, I guess he's kind of throwing out names out there. You mentioned the potential loan route for centre-backs. Mark Gahey, who, of course, was at Swansea last season, Chelsea player as well. So we go back to that kind of Farke and Tuchel relationship that's obviously brought Billy Gilmour to the club. Is that one that you could see as viable? I mean, he's relatively small, isn't he, for a centre-back, but certainly on the ball was very good for Swansea last season.
Yeah, I like him. Yeah, he's an athlete, though, as well. Funnily enough, I've seen Palace have been linked with him this morning. So, depends what Chelsea's plans are for him. Clearly, I don't think he's going to be threatening Chelsea's first team. He's had a championship loan, so it's not beyond the realms that Chelsea would now want to move him up a degree in terms of if it's a loan and go for Premier League. But I don't know. With that type of signing, you'd fear, and I'm not saying for 1 minute that there's been a firm commitment from Norwich, but like a Gilmour, for example, I'm sure that there's an expectation that they will play serious amounts of minutes. Otherwise, why are you, if you're a Chelsea, what is the value in letting Norwich take Billy Gilmour and then just giving him a series of cameos off the bench? So, whether it's a sort of an understanding or whether it's actually written in, that's probably going to be the case with Gilmour, and that would be the case with that man as well, I'm sure. And if that is the case, I'm not sure Norwich could make that commitment for a Premier League centre-back, given it's probably going to be Gibson and Hanley, if Hanley's and Gibson, for that matter, are both fit and firing for Liverpool. So, but yeah, no, it's a good shout, Chelsea. We know how tight he is with Guardiola. I don't know, I've not had a look at Man City, but I'm sure they've got a few young, highly rated centre-backs in the mix as well. Maybe send Diaz our way. That would be good, wouldn't it?
It wouldn't be bad at all, would it? Yeah, he'd fit in nicely. Although if he could get in there ahead of Grant Hanley, which would be a good little battle. Yeah. Let's see what else we've got here. This is an interesting one. I think someone tweeted us yesterday and asked us this actually. That Joe Keeler has asked, how come Norwich went in for Elise? Only cost Palace £8 million from Reading. He's 19. Did very well, didn't he, at Reading in the Championship last season? Caught a lot of people's eyes. There's this release clause that. Even Reading fans that I spoke to weren't totally sure if it actually existed or not, and Paunovic, the manager, didn't really seem to know either. Palace apparently knew and have activated it. £8 million. He's now a Crystal Palace player. What is it about that sort of deal that maybe has seen Norwich City avoid it, I suppose, is Joe's probably question.
Well, I mean, if what you've just said there about even Reading's coach didn't know there was a clause, then how did Palace know there's a clause?
Well, he might have been maybe preventing other people from knowing about the clause. Yeah. That's probably a better way to describe it, isn't it?
But if that is the case, and there was a little bit of sort of smoke and mirrors around his contractual status, the fact that Palace have known about that tells me that there was some should we say, back channel negotiations going on. And if that is the case, then I'm not saying for 1 minute he was a player who was high on Norwich's radar. But if he had been, sounds like Palace had stolen a march anyway. So it's I don't think it's a case of why we're not Norwich in for that type of player, because of course they'd have been aware of him. They saw him at close quarters last season. I remember Daniel Farke after the Reading game towards the end of the season where he was good. Ajaria was very good that day at Carrow Road, and obviously Norwich romped away with it in the second half. But Daniel saying before and after the game, what an excellent group of young players they had at Reading. So there's no two ways about it. They'd have been well aware of the guy, but it sounds to me, reading between the lines, that Palace had done the legwork and were, very quick off the marks. So I don't think it was a case that Norwich have missed out. Probably an acceptance that, they didn't really stand much of a chance if he was a player. And I'm not sure he would have been given. They've done the business they did for Rashica. I think, don't think he was one they were actively looking at, albeit they don't know fully how good he was. But he's potential. He is. He's a very talented player, but a very young player. And of course, is that because we're saying Zaha might be out the door and they're doing their business in advance? it wouldn't be beyond the realms. There's been a lot of talk about him every window, seemingly, for the last 2 or 3 summers.
Lost 10 summers, isn't it?
Well, maybe longer than that, yeah. So could this be the window he goes? And if he does, a little bit like the Celtic and Ajer situation, Palace have already got their blow in first and brought this lad in. And if that is the case, be interested to see how he adapts. Who was the guy that got out of QPR? Eze, yeah. He's an excellent player as well. Palace seem to know how to source a very decent, highly rated young wide player. So I'll be interested to see how he adapts, actually, yeah, because there's no doubt the talent is there.
Just very quickly on this before we move on to other questions. We've got heaps to get through, 15 minutes to get through them, so we're probably not going to get through them all. But does this show maybe how Norwich have moved on in terms of their recruitment? Palace are signing a 19-year-old who's not played in the Premier League. You said they're unproven. That word. Stuart Webber in his sort of, when he was speaking to us earlier this summer, spoke about kind of getting those oven-ready players, to coin that phrase, that could step on to a Premier League stage and immediately make an impact. We've seen a lot of the links so far be fairly domestic. When we talk about Christopher Ajer, of course, at Celtic, which is Scotland, not completely domestic, but in the United Kingdom, and Philip Billing being perhaps 2 of the major targets this summer, both playing on this island essentially. Is that maybe a reason why also Norwich probably wouldn't have looked at Elise or his sort of profile of player because of where they've come in the last couple of seasons or so?
I think it comes down to finances, Connor. And ultimately, it's only being reported, so we'll take that with a pinch of salt, but if it is 8 million on a teenager, 20-year-old, who hasn't really done anything at the top level, I think where Norwich are in their cycle, they can't afford 8 million on a player of that profile. That they need a little bit more certainty. And of course, you could say, well, Rashica has never set foot in England, bar the odd game for his country and his club in European competition. But so there's an element of gamble there. But then, he's, albeit he had a poor season by his standards last season in the Bundesliga, but prior to that, he looked a very, very useful operator in one of the top leagues in Europe. So I think there's a body of work there that would probably reassure Norwich that the outlay they've done represents good value, and also that he can produce in the here and now. Whereas with an Elise, there's no guarantee, is there? And I've painted that scenario there that Zaha could move on, but if Zaha doesn't move on, then you can almost allow that lad to adapt in his own time and bring him in and bring him out behind Eze and Zaha. Palace are maybe in a situation because of the sustained Premier League access to the revenue that they've had, the amount of years they've stayed in the top flight, that they can do that type of recruitment. Although it's going to be very interesting how they get on with Vieira. I'm not sure that could go one or two ways, couldn't it, really? Yeah. But for Norwich, I just think at those levels, yes, for the guy, potentially what he could go on to be, 8 million looks in this market where we are now, that looks probably not too bad. But I just think given Norwich have a finite amount of resource and they've done the Rashica deal, I don't think that they could really spend that type of money on the type of profile that Elise is.
Yeah, and they've also got Todd Cantwell, haven't they, in a similar position, a couple of years older as well. So there's a pathway point, and maybe having too many of a similar type of players. So yeah, lots of elements to maybe why Norwich didn't do that deal, if they would have been aware of it at all. Interesting one from Mark, not specifically about transfers, so we'll go over it quickly. But I guess there's a couple of players in here that we can maybe offer something on. Any news on last season's injuries to Timu Pukki, who obviously we saw at the Euros, which would imply now that he's certainly on holiday, but hopefully recovering and he's going to be in a good enough state to start that opening Premier League game against Liverpool. Ben Gibson, McLean and Byram. Obviously we had the line last weekend, didn't we, from Kenny McLean saying not that there'd been a setback, but maybe there hadn't been any progression in terms of his recovery, and his return to training has been pushed back a little bit. So that's a tighter deadline between him returning and that Liverpool game, which maybe now would make it seem unlikely that he would be involved in that. Ben Gibson and Sam Byram, though, Pad, I'll throw those two your way. Any sort of updates or developments in terms of those two?
Yeah. Spoke to the club on those two in the last couple of days, actually. And take Gibson first. Yeah, they hope towards the back end of pre-season he will be fully available. Anybody who's followed his social media has been doing a lot of personal training work. I think he took one of the Norwich sports science / physios with him on holiday, didn't he? I saw him out there. That's not a bad gig. If you're one of the Norwich employees, getting a bit of sun on your back as well as rehabbing Ben Gibson. But was led to believe that we probably won't see him in any of the early pre-season stuff, but the expectation is that he would be available for the Liverpool selection, as we hope. Hanley, who isn't on that list, but by all accounts, that was it hamstring with Big Grant. I think it was, wasn't it? It isn't the hamstring he had surgery on before, and it isn't the type of strain that would concern Norwich unduly in terms of his availability for Liverpool. So, yeah, positive on Gibson. Byram, he's basically the next sort of week, 10 days is when he will actually try and be reintegrated back into full team training. I still think they're obviously a bit erring on the side of caution. You know, there's a guy who Liverpool we're talking about. That was his last appearance for Norwich, and that was March of the previous year. And that was a hamstring, and then he had all sorts of complications and had to have follow-up surgery. But there is an optimism amongst City's physio department and sports science, from what I'm led to believe, that he will be able to handle the load when he's reintegrated fully back into team training. And of course, if he comes through that over the next sort of week, 2 weeks, possibly you would start to see him. I think for me, they've got the two behind closed doors games in about 10 days' time or so. They've got Lincoln and Huddersfield. Subject to him coming through this next period in terms of training and having no adverse reaction to obviously stepping up the load, because it's a different scenario entirely to doing rehab and individual work to actually fully, going into a team training environment on the grass. But if he comes through that without any issues, then I think it's reasonable to expect we might see him in one of those two games. And he is key. He is key because you've got, as it stands, Max Aaron's on the right. You've got Yanulis on the left. Okay, Matt, you could say Barley Mumba's in the mix. I don't think Sam McCallum will be, because I think they'll look to get him back out on loan. So you're going to need Sam Byram fit and available, because, irrespective of whether Max stays or not, Sam Byram is going to probably be needed, because it's unrealistic to think you get through a season without sort of disruption, either injury or suspension, to your fullback areas. So, yeah, that's an intriguing one for me. We're talking about the recruitment and the priorities. Heaven forbid there is a setback, but if there was with Sam Byram over these next sort of week, 10 days, then you might need to sort of have a look again in terms of, irrespective of the Max Aaron situation and his future, you might have to have a look again in that area, because, with the greatest respect, you can't probably put too much pressure on Barley Mumba at the minute to step up and be a viable frontline Premier League option. So, yeah, probably safe to say with Sam, next week to 10 days will tell us a lot about, is he going to be a big part of Norwich's Premier League season, I think. Yeah,
it's going to be really interesting to see how that develops and that situation. Obviously, we hope that Sam can make a full recovery, because it's been a difficult year and a half really for him, hasn't it, since he limped out of that game against Liverpool, and some really good individual performances in Norwich City's Premier League campaign 2 seasons ago. So hopefully he can return to the level he was at. Interesting question from Tom. There's a couple of questions that we're getting asked quite a lot, so we'll come to those after this one. But this is quite.
When are you getting your crew cut, Connor? Is that one of them?
Yeah, soon. I promise, definitely soon. We're getting to that stage now. Tom said, have any players from the Euros caught your eye, especially those that Norwich could afford? I wrote a piece on this. I put 5 together.
I'm just going to kick that over to you, mate. Tell them about the Steven Zubar speculation, mate. Tell them that story.
Yeah, well, I fear that I may have accidentally created that.
There's no fear. That's I did.
Yeah, I did. That was probably down to me. So I wrote something about potentially 5 players that, and again, not without the extensive data that the Norwich City recruitment team do. And of course, we bow down to their knowledge on players. Just 5 players that I've kind of like the look of and that have interested me in the Euros. Steven Zubar was one of those. And obviously, of course, they had to be in Norwich's remit. I took one look at Mikkel Damsgaard, who scored that free kick for Denmark the other night, and saw 40 million in Leeds, and said, "Yeah, that's not viable." Then, so these were players that were supposedly in the financial sphere that Norwich could operate in, but also have been fairly decent. He is one of those, although he's sort of 29, 30. So again, we can probably hark back to the debate we had last week about what you get for that. I think I don't know if he still has, but there was one stage of the tournament that he had the most assists. I think he got a hat-trick of assists in one game, which always helps, but has been fairly good, to be honest, at the Euros. Germany, obviously, a market that Norwich City know well. So wrote this all in the piece, all good. That went up. And then about a week or so later, we get an article from a Swiss organisation.
Yeah,
I was off the day this all kicked off, so I missed it a little bit. But Swiss organisation who had cited the article, which then some other people took and ran with. So safe to say he's not a player that Norwich City are looking at. There are 4 others in there that you can probably find if you go to
Pinkham.com. This is the power you wield, Connor. This is the power you wield. Your pen is mightier than the sword, mate.
It is, absolutely. There you go. But there you go. You can cross the line through Stephen Zubar if anyone was asking about that. Lots of questions about Todd Cantwell and his situation again. Some people asking about whether he'll run down his contract. Cameron Downs on YouTube just says Todd Cantwell contract ? Simon, Todd needs to get his contract. Lee, any news on if Cantwell's going to sign a new contract? So this has dominated quite a few of the questions that have come in the last 10 minutes or so, Pad. So I'll throw this one over to you. We've kind of mapped out his situation in depth, I think, in terms of it's a big summer and it's kind of a crossroads, isn't it? Because 1 year left officially, but Norwich have that club option that they can activate to extend it for a year. And then obviously we get into the nuts and bolts of what that would entail and the value decreasing, all the stuff we've spoken about before. Where do you feel at the moment we're at with Todd Cantwell's contract? Because it feels like at the moment there's probably quite a bit of patience on both sides around this particular sort of situation.
Yeah, well, I mean, the main man, Mr. Webber, started the summer, he said basically what happens to Todd in terms of the market will dictate what happens with the contract. The two are interlinked. You know, if he didn't go in this window, and I've seen 1 or 2 bits of speculation, but again, like Max, nothing tangible has landed at Norwich's door as far as we're aware. Then the contract situation is irrelevant. But if he was to still stay here, then you've got, as you say, 2023 de facto with the option, which I'm sure they would take up. Then the clock starts to tick. And one thing you can guarantee is City will not get into a Christopher Ajer situation with Todd Cantwell. Absolutely not. Not with Stuart Webber at the helm. And so there'll either be a new deal or, you know, we could get to either the January window or more likely maybe this time next summer where he'd only have 12 months left. And irrespective of where Norwich are in terms of the status of their league position, you know, if Todd Cantwell, hypothetically, this time next summer hadn't signed a new deal and is approaching the final 12 months, there is no way Norwich would allow that situation to get to a point where he goes for nothing, essentially, or compensation. So it isn't 100% pressing, is it? Ultimately, because you've still got 2 seasons left to go. From what I can gather, I think they see him as part of the Premier League plans this season. So they're not actively looking to offload him in this window. That I think they maybe now in a post Wendia world, his value increases as well. Like you said earlier, you know, he can play a wider position in those 3 behind the striker, but he can also play down the middle. And in fact, when he came through in the academy, that was probably where you thought he would end up, in that 10 role. We've seen glimpses of it at senior level, and I've got no doubt he could play that role. Very, very, very technically gifted young footballer. So I wouldn't panic necessarily at the minute from a Norwich fan regarding Todd Cantwell. I think he'll still be here unless, you know, there is a club who come and put down the money that Norwich want for that player, same as Max Aaron, in that situation. But at this stage, I think they're planning with him as part of the Premier League season. And if that is the case, you can be pretty sure maybe when we get this window out of the way, a new contract for Todd Cantwell will be fairly high up Stuart Webber's list. And just finally on that, Stuart did say, you know, that he wasn't unduly concerned in terms of Todd, because Todd, you know, he is a lad from his neck of the woods. We know what Norwich City means to him and to his family, as opposed to maybe a player who doesn't have those roots and isn't part of the community and hasn't come from the same fan base who follow him. So I think Stuart Webber was fairly relaxed at the start of the summer that you know that if the scenario is that it's a new contract that needs to be put on the table, that there would be a broad agreement from all parties that there could be a solution reached. So yeah, I would at this stage, that's pretty low down the priority list. I think if you're Stuart Webber, I think it's about adding to the current squad, and they feel Todd Cantwell is part of that mix that they want to add to. So, you know, but it's a bit like with Stuart's own contract situation. These things will continue to get talked about because, you know, if you're Norwich and you set yourself up as a self-funding club, then one of the pillars is player trading. And if that's the case, one of your better players and one of your highest value players, you simply cannot allow him to go for a song, basically. So, at the minute, this window, not a major issue, would become a major issue as we progress forward, no doubt about it.
Yeah, absolutely. Lots of people pointing out surrounding our Mark Gahey chat that you can only have one player on loan from one club at one time. So that is right. So that would shut that down pretty quickly. I think
he's not coming to Norwich, Connor. I'll tell you that now.
There you go. Happy that. Well, you can say it with certainty now. Yeah, absolutely. Pad, thank you very much. I think we've answered the bulk of the questions there that we've done quite well today, actually. We'll end with Denise, who says hello from Malaysia. So thank you, Denise, for watching all the way out there. We're getting around the globe very quickly indeed. Pinkin.com, of course, the place to go for any updates in terms of Norwich City transfer news and rumours. Lots of stuff on there as well today to get your teeth into as we build up to pre-season. Of course, all kicks off next weekend, or next Friday rather, not next weekend, at the Walks with that game against Kings Lynn, which is going to be our sort of first sighter of everybody and how people have come back to pre-season. Always incredibly exciting, the first one, and of course fans can attend as well. I think there's some tickets left, isn't there, if people want to come along to the Walks and watch that. And of course, if you have tuned in late and you have missed the first half or first part of the show, then they will be available wherever you're watching this now on demand for you to watch back. Pad, thank you very much. Thank you all very much for watching, and we'll see you again very, very soon. Goodbye.